Following on his claim that Old Testament passages predicted the betrayal of Jesus by Judas, Bob Dutko, Christian apologist and radio talk show host, goes on to assert that the ancient scriptures also prophesied the exact amount of payment Judas received for his treachery.
You know, Zechariah 11:12 prophesies that the Messiah will be betrayed specifically for 30 pieces of silver. Do you realize what the odds are of centuries before some prophet predicting that this Messiah is going to be betrayed by a close friend for specifically 30 pieces of silver, which is exactly what Judas betrayed Jesus for. Matthew 26:14 and 15 says, "Then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What are you willing to give me to deliver him up to you?' And they weighed out to him 30 pieces of silver." End quote. So what, you think the chief priests were saying, "Ooh, let's make sure to do 30 pieces of silver because we want to make sure to fulfill that prophecy in Zechariah"? Come on.
Astonishing if true, no doubt. As noted already in episode 31, most scholars refer to Zechariah chapters 9 through 14, in which we find this so-called prophecy concerning Judas's payment for his betrayal of Christ, as 2nd Zechariah, noting that it was likely composed much later than Zechariah chapters 1 through 8, known as 1st Zechariah, and knitted together by a later editor. The date most often given for the composition of 2nd Zechariah is sometime in the 5th century BCE, after the Babylonian exile. And while scholars still struggle to find the exact historical setting for much of Zechariah, and particularly for chapter 11 of the book, the exact historicity of the passage offered by Dutko as fulfilled prophecy isn't as much of a concern here as merely understanding the passage's references within its own context. So, does Zechariah 11:12 really prophesy that a future Messiah will be betrayed by a close friend specifically for 30 pieces of silver, as the Apologist claims? Of course, the only way to find out is to read the passage in question. "And I said to them, 'If it is good in your sight, give me my wages, but if not, never mind.' So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages." There is so little here in this single verse that it is impossible to tell who is demanding wages, who was weighing out the 30 shekels of silver, and what work was done which prompted the request for payment. We know, of course, from the New Testament story of Judas's betrayal of Jesus that Bob Dutko thinks is foretold in this passage, that the person demanding payment is Judas, and those weighing out the coinage are the chief priests. But is that what Zechariah is saying? Indeed not. The context of Zechariah 11:12 is that of the prophet Zechariah in the role of a shepherd in the service of his God Yahweh, and the people of Israel symbolized as a flock. As noted by Katrina Larkin in the Oxford Bible Commentary on Zechariah, in chapter 11, Zechariah could be repudiating the complacency of a theocratic leadership pictured as greedy and ruthless, or reflecting contemporary tension between Jerusalem and Samaria, or simply picturing the relationship between God, prophet, and people typologically. The negativity of the imagery then stems from this prophet's intuition that the people do not in fact welcome good shepherding, and that prophetic leadership therefore entails suffering. The passage appears to turn the image of Davidic leadership as good upside down, criticizing it. As such, Larkin notes, it has been seen as anti-establishment as well as anti-messianic. In other words, Zechariah 11 has nothing whatsoever to do with prophecy regarding a future Messiah, as the Apologist claims. With this in mind, reading the leading passages of Zechariah 11 will help place verse 12 into this larger and proper context. "Thus says the Lord my God, pasture the flock doomed to slaughter. Those who buy them slay them and go unpunished, and each of those who sell them says, 'Blessed be the Lord, for I have become rich.' And their own shepherds have no pity on them. For I shall no longer have pity on the inhabitants of the land, declares the Lord. But behold, I shall cause the men to fall, each into another's power, and into the power of his king. And they will strike the land, and I shall not deliver them from their power. So I pastured the flock, doomed to slaughter, hence the afflicted of the flock. And I took for myself 2 staffs, the one I called favor, and the other I called union. So I pastured the flock. Then I annihilated the 3 shepherds in 1 month, for my soul was impatient with them, and their soul also was weary of me. Then I said, I will not pasture you. What is to die, let it die, and what is to be annihilated, let it be annihilated. And let those who are left eat one another's flesh." And I took my staff favor and cut it in pieces to break my covenant which I had made with all the peoples. So it was broken on that day, and thus the afflicted of the flock who were watching me realized that it was the word of the Lord. And I said to them, if it is good in your sight, give me my wages, but if not, never mind. So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages. As is obvious, it is difficult at times to know who is sometimes speaking here, the prophet or Yahweh himself. It is the reason this chapter has puzzled scholars and commentators for centuries. Nevertheless, it is also obvious that the one seeking payment in this passage is not a close friend who betrays a future Messiah, but the prophet himself, Zechariah. Those weighing out the coins are the people, not the chief priests of the temple in first century Jerusalem. George Klein, professor of Old Testament and the chair of the Old Testament department at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, brings the passages regarding payment into sharper focus in his commentary on Zechariah. Verse 12 overviews the final severance of the employment between the shepherd portrayed by Zechariah and the people he sought to lead back to God. The request for pay leads to the final transaction when terminating their relationship. The shepherd's desire for money only partially provides his motivation. Rather, the shepherd sought to underscore the finality of the broken relationship between himself and the nation, and symbolically between the Lord and Judah. The price, 30 pieces of silver, represents the lowly price a slave was worth in the earliest era in Israel's history. The money the shepherd received was tantamount to slave wages. The exchange drips with the people's disdain for their estimation of the value of the shepherd. His value to the entire nation did not even surpass the worth of one slave to a single family. The monetary value ascribed to the shepherd forcefully spoke of the trifling attitude of the nation to their shepherd and their God who had sent him. When the shepherd cried out, "Give me my pay," or "keep it," he could not contain the depth of emotion that had built over time to an unbearable level. When he said, "Keep it," the shepherd did not attempt to conceal his disdain for the people's cavalier attitude toward righteousness and his efforts to lead the people back to God. The translation, "Don't bother," would well reflect the exasperation the shepherd felt toward the people and the impossible task of shepherding them. So plainly, verse 12 had nothing whatsoever to do with Judas's betrayal of Jesus and payment for his treachery. It needs to be noted, however, that nowhere in Matthew's narrative about the payment given to Judas is it mentioned that the payment, or the amount itself, was in fulfillment of any prophecy. Matthew's gospel merely reads, as Dutko quotes, "Then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What are you willing to give me to deliver him up to you?' And they weighed out to him 30 pieces of silver, and from then on he began looking for a good opportunity to betray him." The mention of fulfilled prophecy regarding the payment is found in Matthew chapter 27, regarding what the chief priests do with the money when it is returned to them by Judas. Then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to that yourself." And he threw the pieces of silver into the sanctuary and departed, and he went away and hanged himself. And the chief priests took the pieces of silver and said, "It is not lawful to put them into the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood." And they counseled together, and with the money bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. For this reason that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, "And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me." The passage regarding the payment of 30 shekels of silver, however, was not spoken through Jeremiah the prophet, as we have seen, but found instead in the writings of the prophet Zechariah. Nonetheless, the quoted prophecy in Matthew, "And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me," is itself not found in either Jeremiah or Zechariah. Nowhere in the writings of the prophets is anyone directed to take 30 pieces of silver paid by the sons of Israel and buy with it a potter's field. In Zechariah 11, Zechariah the prophet takes the 30 pieces of silver paid to him for his prophetic services and tosses it back into the temple. What is of particular interest here is exactly where Zechariah tosses the coins. "Then the Lord said to me, 'Throw it to the potter, that magnificent price at which I was valued by them.' So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them to the potter in the house of the Lord. There is some controversy among scholars over whether the Hebrew term used in the text is meant to mean treasury or potter, as it could be translated either way. The NRSV has treasury, for example, while the NIV has potter. Apparently, the author of Matthew wanted to cover all his bases on the possible meaning of the word, so he constructed his narrative such that Judas throws his ill-gotten coins into the temple treasury, which is then removed by the chief priests and used to purchase a potter's field. Quite clever. So, while indeed the odds of some prophet centuries earlier predicting the Messiah as being betrayed by a close friend for specifically 30 pieces of silver are astronomical, it's a shame for apologists like Bob Dutko that no such prophecy can be found in the ancient Hebrew scriptures in reference to Judas and Jesus. Funding for this program was provided in part by the generous contributions of viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you.